Meet Christine. She loves shopping. And this is the sound of fashion overload. Too many fabulous things, not enough space. So Christine started selling with The RealReal.
I've always loved collecting designer pieces. Gucci bags, Prada heels. But my style keeps evolving. Selling with The RealReal? Game changer. I earn more, and they do everything.
Seriously, just drop off your items or schedule a pickup. We handle the photos, descriptions, pricing, even shipping. You just sit back and watch your items sell fast to our 38 million members.
And I get peace of mind knowing I earn more selling with The RealReal than anywhere else.
Exactly. That's the sound of your closet working for you. The RealReal. Earn more, save time, sell fast. And right now, you can get an extra $100 site credit when you sell for the first time. Go to therealreal.com to get your extra $100. Therealreal.com. That's therealreal.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Adrian Martin, the author of a new book, Filmmakers Thinking. Welcome to the show, Adrian.
Thank you, John.
And in over 250 episodes, I think that's the first time I've ever said welcome to the show. So already we're in new territory. What show? It's just like, first of all, it's only audio, so that's wrong. By the way, if you enjoy the show, please remember to spread it on social media, leave a review, 5 stars, please. Any of that helps. There's no one else promoting us except you. So thank you so much if you do that, and please continue to do that. Adrian, this book is a real revelation to me, and I thought it was a really interesting idea that let's just sit down and put together the way filmmakers think about what they are doing. But you say in the introduction this book came from like a part of your teaching. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, and indeed the central concept of the book, I can't lay claim to inventing it, because there's a film school in Spain where I live, and the film school is called ECFE. And it's a very special film school. It only has sort of like 1 year, like every year it's a new cohort of around 40 students, and they pick a specialisation in either film making, sort of film curating, or film restoration, technical restoration. But they all mix in with each other's sort of classes, and there are some subjects that everyone takes, or that there are electives. So the guy who's the mastermind of ECFE is a wonderful guy, Carlos Mugiro, and he's been a critic, a teacher, filmmaker. And he came up with this idea that he wanted this subject that was open to all of the students, no matter what main area they were in. And he wanted it to be the concept of what he called the filmmakers thinking. And because he had this intuition that maybe, particularly considering you've got the students for 1 year, maybe we should go straight to what the filmmakers say and think and express, rather than try to work through the now many decades of critics and other people, theorists, talking about what filmmakers do, as it were, at one remove. Well, let's go straight to the filmmakers, not only necessarily their writing or their books, but other things, other kinds of documents. And this is where I got into it, and I was asked to teach this subject, and I thought, well, let's not just do what Sergei Eisenstein wrote in a book, and what Tarkovsky wrote in a book, and what Pasolini's essays collected in a book. Let's broaden this out a bit, Let's include some interviews with filmmakers. Let's include sort of shorter pieces by filmmakers, wherever you can find them, and this is one of the things that I really tried to impress on the students is that if you want to know what filmmakers think about what they do, sometimes you're going to have to look in unusual places, say for instance if when David Cronenberg was given a major honorary degree by a university. Well, David Cronenberg has to get up and talk for an hour about why he deserves that award. And what he said in that hour is absolutely amazing. Like it's beyond whatever he's said in interviews or that he's ever written down for any occasional piece of writing. He did this incredible thing about, art is crime. Art has to be a criminal activity, and he tried to impress on all of the students listening to him that you're criminals now. Like embrace this, and I thought this is wild, and so I started looking for these unusual kind of sources, such as, for instance, filmmakers' statements of intention, which tend to be things that filmmakers just give their main crew, or perhaps the producer or the financier or whatever it may be. They'll just write 2 pages about a film they want to make and how they envisage that film. But these statements can sometimes be quite remarkable, And I discovered that some filmmakers are happy to give them to you if you ask, I mean, they're not totally private documents. And
You
and
mentioned
so
Bertrand Bonello has like a screenplay and a sort of a kind of lookbook or a sort of side document which is incredibly detailed, and he'll give them to the heads of department. He'll give that document as well as a screenplay, and he says in the book, this is almost as important as a screenplay for me.
yeah, it's. I think, in fact, if we researched it, we'd find a lot of filmmakers: Kelly Reichardt, Bonello that you've mentioned. I'm sure many Pedro Costa. They all do some version of the lookbook or the image book, or they all have their own name for it. But basically, it's a document where, as well as words, they're putting pictures, and maybe it's simply something they tore out of a magazine. It's a picture of a person sitting on a hill, but it gave them a visual idea. So they glue it into their book, and they start to gather these sorts of visual fragments and perhaps notes about bits of music they're listening to, a poem they read, some notes about the screenplay, and this builds up into its own work of art. It's like this collage work of art. And Pedro Costa, for instance, has exhibited his lookbooks in museum exhibitions. That's how proud he is of those. So I think it's important to sort of to go looking and sometimes to go asking, filmmakers, what have you got in that sort of box in your back room from when you made such and such a film, and you'll often find remarkable documents.
One of the points of resistance that you might receive, in fact, you mentioned this, I think, in your introduction, is maybe some filmmakers prefer to keep a mystique to their process, and other filmmakers resist the notion that they are themselves the prime author. That you talk about
Yes.
an exchange you had with Jeff Nichols where he's talking about, well, you think I'm the most important person framing the shot and setting up the mise en scène and all these things, and I've got my cinematographer to do that, and the professional editor edits a film, and the musician does the soundtrack. So he sort of belittles he resists the idea of the auteur theory is essentially what he's doing. I mean, there's 2 points here that I'd kind of like to make. One is that how do you get through that mystique? How do you get through those people who are maybe reticent? And the second point is the people who aren't reticent. Is there a danger that they might be creating a public persona of the director, which is kind of the opposite of what Jeff Nichols is doing, where they say, I do everything in the film, nothing goes past me without my approval, and sort of retrospectively perhaps fitting a persona to the films that had nothing to do with the actual process of making the film, or it's a fiction about how I made the film. I mean, sorry, those are 2 quite very big questions, actually, but please.
Well, both good ones. I mean, in terms of directors like Jet Nichols, like Stephen Frears, who play down the auteur theory or attack it. Mike Nichols was another prominent example of somebody who had no time for the auteur theory as such. And they, rightly stress that they work with a team and, great collaborators, cinematographers and sound people and actors and so on. And for me, the auteur approach, which is certainly the approach I use, but for me, it shouldn't be such a controversy as it's continued to be, all of these decades, because for me, the director is kind of more like the ringmaster than the person who creates from nothing. It's not like the film director has a blank page or a blank canvas and the film is projected out of his or her mind. No, of course it's not that. But they are finally, when it comes down to it, the choice of, will that wall be blue or brown, and will that actor sit or stand? I mean, finally, the person who everyone looks to make that decision is the director. And the director is the person who is at the centre of the crucial and all of the minor and the major decisions about how a film is going to be shaped. And so in that's how I understand the director as auteur. They're the sort of the centre of the creative process, because there has to be a centre. If there's no centre, everything's flying off in a million directions. So sometimes you can speak to these grumpier filmmakers and kind of, when you put it to them that way, that you make the choice finally, well, they can't disagree with that because they know that from every day of their working lives. The other question you raised, which is very important, the one about, do some directors, in a sense, overestimate their own mystique or their own role? And I'll give you a very good example of this. I was recently rereading Joseph von Sternberg's memoir, his autobiography, which is called Fun in a Chinese Laundry, which he wrote in the mid-60s, not very long before he died, actually. And to read Sternberg, you wouldn't think that there was anybody else on the crew. I mean, he says, I did the cinematography. I personally did the lighting. I supervised the soundtrack. He literally claims credit for everything. And then even when it comes to actors, when Marlene Dietrich blinked her left eye, I told her to blink her left eye. And there's such a, monomania of his idea of himself as the total artist and the total controller of every single frame of the film. And at a certain point, you've got to wonder, because he did work with very wonderful cinematographers and, composers and, sometimes even writers who were the people he most dismisses, in the process. There was some script, but that was nothing. Then I, Joseph von Sternberg, came in and made it art. Sort of, that was his self-image, and probably it's a bit exaggerated. With Sternberg's film. I mean, I love Sternberg's films, and there's no doubt that he was an auteur by any reckoning. His personality, his style is all over his work. But you really want to get into the studio records and find out, well, maybe what did the cinematographer give to this film, that wasn't all just Joe. And so that's curious. I think some directors, and probably more today than ever, some directors sort of find themselves or push themselves in this direction of sort of claiming total credit. I partly blame film festivals for this, John, because if you direct a film and you work closely with your crew and it gets accepted for the Chicago Film Festival, it's you who gets invited. You, the director, gets invited to speak before the crowd. There are sometimes other crew members there, but not as a matter of course, not as a matter of habit, right? So we're not used to seeing editors, cinematographers, composers standing next to the director on any film festival stage, Cannes, Venice, whatever it is. We're not getting their input. So I think this may stoke the sort of sometimes slight megalomania of some directors and their self-presentation. because as we know, there's so much pressure on this thing now of directors having to sort of sell themselves as personalities above and beyond the actual work that they do, making a film and the actual film itself. They have to be somehow interesting personalities. And this surely does reinforce this thing of the ego of the director.
Well, in a sense, that's also one of the things, to go back a little bit to the Jeff Nichols anti-autorist point, is that's one of the jobs of the director, is to have their team, so that you'll find a director will often work with a limited number of cinematographers. I mean, Steven Spielberg from Jurassic Park onwards has had the same cinematographer. How I wish he hadn't, but they get their team. They're comfortable with their team. They have the soundtrack is given, and it also that begins to become, why do we watch those Peter Greenaway movies in the 80s? It's because Michael Nyman is doing the soundtrack, and he has a very, that gives them a certain flavor, which without that soundtrack, those films, I contend, would be a full third, lower in terms of artistic achievement. I don't know. That's a very random statement, but I think you get my point. To go back to the festivals, and this is a really interesting point. Festivals are also a place where directors talk to each other. And I'm sort of interested in how that works as well. When you find, if you'll often find a director might pop up as a cameo appearance in somebody else's film, and you think, oh well, they've been to dinner at some festival. That's how that's happened, And Abel Ferrara is now in a Safdie's brother film. And by the way, the best thing in Marty Supreme is Abel Ferrara's.
I agree.
What about that cross fertilization? How does that work?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, John, because I've sort of been sometimes at those dinner tables that you speak of at film festivals, where sometimes the most bizarre assortment of very mainstream and very avant-garde or independent directors are all sort of sitting together at tables. And there's the famous story of Pedro Costa meeting Quentin Tarantino, and they got along like a house on fire. They had a lot to talk about with each other, and sometimes surprising little linkages. And in my observation, when filmmakers get together, at least in this sort of semi-public way of of a crowded dinner table, it's a lot of it is very practical talk, about funding, about gee, how am I going to get the last $50,000 to make my next film? Well, why don't you try this European fund, or why don't you try this philanthropist in America? And they're helping each other with a lot of tips. It's not so much, in my observation, it's not so much, oh, I'd like to read your script, and, would you look at the rough cut of my film? I mean, that happens too, of course. But it tended to be, very pragmatic, practical banter about how to get on in the film industry, how to keep going, how to keep raising money, which of course is on every filmmaker's mind at every level. So, I do think there are all sorts of sometimes very unusual connections that get made. You could probably write a whole secret history of that, of the way certain, directors got together. And Godard, for instance, Godard tells the story of meeting Skolomovsky, and this is in the mid '60s, right? Jerzy Skolomovsky had just begun making films, and and everyone was saying to him, "Oh, your films are so Godardian," and he hadn't seen a Godard film at that stage, 65, whatever it was. He hadn't even seen a Godard film. He hadn't had a chance, and then he met Godard himself, and Godard said, "Look, you've got to win the main prize, young man. So I'm going to help you get the main prize at this festival," and Godard did his own politicking behind the scenes, right? And from that moment, Skolomovsky said, "I was a fan of Godard." Then I went and watched the films, and they were good too, But it was literally one filmmaker helping another out, in the politics behind the scenes there.
I think it's also really interesting as well when filmmakers have such a different, very, polar opposite conceptions of how to make a film, um, and they will both give you extremely convincing philosophical grounding for that decision. I'll give you one example which has come up recently in stuff I've been reading and watching. But there's the directors who like to do like one, maximum two takes and move on. Jim Jarmusch, I was talking to for an interview recently, had that. He says if he does three or four takes, he's kind of tired, and plus he's a very low budget filmmaker, and they've got to get a lot of shots done in one day. Um, Clint Eastwood famously, also John Ford, if somebody falls off the horse, well, they fell off the horse. That happens. And then you've got, David Fincher and Stanley Kubrick and people like that who want to do, you know, multiple takes. And, David Fincher will absolutely, defend his choice that, you've done all the expensive stuff, and now all you need to, you've got everyone in front of you, get it right, so if it takes 100 takes, it takes 100 takes.
Mm. Mm. Yes, it's there must be some interesting and probably more private conversations between very different filmmakers on this level. Uh, yeah, and in a way, I find generally that filmmakers tend to respect each other, even if they're extremely different in their
Right.
aesthetic, their style. Perhaps when it comes to politics, there have some more heat sort of going on there. But when it comes to style and manner of filming, and whether it's two takes or 100 takes, I mean, directors are sort of interested in each other, and they're interested in each other's differences too. This is something I certainly have observed on the festival circuit, that a filmmaker of the two take school, which is Philippe Garel, I observed how he interacted with very different filmmakers like Raoul Ruiz and others, and some quite conventional filmmakers. And the conventional filmmakers would be intrigued at Garel's method, which is basically that he rehearses for a year, like one day a week over a year, just at his home and stuff. And, he has the act, they're reading, they're perhaps doing a little improvising, they're working through the scenes, talking about the characters. And they do that for a year, so that when finally the shoot begins, they can do things in one take or two takes. It's that's all sort of been worked out in a very calm and relaxed way. It wasn't a rushed, 1 week rehearsal period. The actors are totally sunk into their parts. They're no conversation needs to happen about why am I doing this and who is my character in this scene, because that's all been worked out over the year before. And I'm sure some more mainstream filmmakers must really envy a process like that when they hear about it. Like, my God, if only, I could have had a year with the actors rather than the week before we began.
Mm.
So I find directors are very intrigued to learn each other's methods.
One of the questions that you begin with, and sort of goes all the way through the book, actually, is this idea of what is cinema as well, of how we define it and how we you talked earlier as well about a creative vision that is projected onto a blank screen. And so, well, that's definitely not what it is, because it takes place in a time where there's political and cultural things already existing. So, and you have other collaborators. How do you see this question as it goes through the book, and how have you changed your own ideas through the writing of this book and looking at these other directors and the filmmakers and their thoughts?
Well, definitely my mind has expanded a lot, sort of since beginning to research and teach and eventually write this book. And I've become really interested in what I understand as the theoretical proposals of filmmakers. Now, let me be clear about this. I'm not talking about a certain sort of arcane academic film theory. I'm talking about if George Miller, walks into the room now and says to us, listen, you guys, filmmaking is storytelling. Above all, it is storytelling. And now that's a theory of film, right?
Mm.
Because for me, a theory of film is saying what is essential to cinema and what is the vocation of cinema. Should cinema be doing? What does it do best, right? So if Spielberg or George Miller says cinema is storytelling, and then Stan Brakhage comes in and says cinema is poetry, right? Now, this is two different conceptions of cinema, and depending on which major conception a person lights on, of course, they then emphasize specific things. One director is really into actors. Stan Brakhage is not into actors because he's painting on the film frame directly. And so it begins to extend, as it were. The theory starts to fill out for each different type of filmmaker and each individual filmmaker. One thing that it was a revelation to me to come across when I was doing the book were the very elaborate sort of statements and presentations of Lucretia Martel. And there's just very recently in the Spanish language a book of her sort of collected pieces and talks, and it really is a great book. I mean, if I do another edition of Filmmakers Thinking, I'll be referring to this, because her whole thing is that film is sound before, like, and above it being image. I mean, what an idea.
Michael Nyman and Peter Greenaway. That's
Yes.
almost kind of
You'll finally get a bit more attention there.
yeah.
And of course, when Martel talks about sound, she doesn't only mean music. She means the whole thing of voices, noise effects, mixing, the atmospheres, layering, everything to do with the sound, the recording of all of the different technical levels and creative levels of a soundtrack. And she has this whole conception of watching a film is like being immersed in water, like the spectator is immersed in a swimming pool, as it were, and all of the sound vibrations are sort of reaching him or her from all directions. And that is her model for how to make a film. It's from that she not only designs the soundtrack, but that's how she writes the plot. That's how she writes the script. That's how she plots the order of events, not in a linear unfolding of the story, but in something that's more like the waves of water or the vibrations of sound and how they affect us. So she begins from sound rather than image, which of course in many other directors it would be the other way completely. Many filmmakers talk about the image in an almost sort of mystical way. Sometimes you want to prod them and say, oh, hey, what about the soundtrack? What about the sound as well? Oh, well, that comes later. That's the way some filmmakers proceed, but not Lucretia Martel. So it really opened my mind to the idea that, there are many, many theories of film, and really it depends on your starting point. What you say or think or feel in your intuition is the primary element of filmmaking. And from whatever you start from, sort of the whole system will develop from there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Jonathan Glazer said the same thing about Zone of Interest. That he said there were two films, one you heard and one you saw,
Yeah.
and it was that dissonance, and that it was like two parallel things going along at the same time. And interestingly, this reflects something that. I spoke with Stephen Volk, the screenwriter, last week, and he had this really interesting concept that very much chimes with how I think about creativity, of the story tells itself. That you kind of, once you've set up the beginning, once you pass the first couple of sentences, then you're kind of riding the horse of the story. And this idea of theory and filmmakers, it's almost as if maybe we're getting it backwards. Maybe the filmmakers sort of post hoc invent the theory that allows them to make the films they make. So George Miller, of course, it's story because that's the absolute drive of his films, and someone like Martel, it's more experimental what she's doing, and yeah. So it's where you begin from, but also maybe a retrospective where how you ended up where you were. How did I get here? Okay, let's go back and find out.
Mm. I think that's a very rich idea, John, because you can look at somebody like Sergei Eisenstein, and he was still theorizing, Battleship Potemkin, like 20 years after he made it, 15, 20 years after he made it. And he was still taking scenes from his own films and sort of using them as the classroom demonstrations for when he was teaching film students. And uh, and even with Eisenstein, who was, of course, a highly, theoretical thinker, and he went into films with certain principles. But of course, there must have been a certain degree of creative intuition, and this works, and I'm going to go in this direction. Just like you're saying, John, that the first scene kind of tells you where to go from there. You go in a certain path, you follow a certain intuition. Many directors talk that way about the actual shooting phase, that they sort of, as it were, not quite stumble upon, but they find their way to a particular kind of framing or a certain kind of rhythm that the scene is following, and then it's like, okay, now this is what I've got to stick with. I've got to follow this through in the rest of what I shoot, so that there's a coherence, there's a unity, and there's an aesthetic to what is being done here. And so I think there's definitely a lot of that intuitive work and sort of finding the path while one is making the film at all levels. And then, I think you're absolutely right that there are directors like Eisenstein, like Pierre Pasolini, I think, to some extent, Tarkovsky. That would be a very interesting case. I don't know who could tell us this today, but Tarkovsky developed what are even rigid theories about the time pressure, the time block, that everything should be a unedited kind of sequence shot block of time. But did he begin with that theory? I doubt it, actually. When he was, as a film student, when he started making work in the early 60s, Ivan's Childhood and so on, was he already thinking about time pressure and time blocks and the sequence shot? No, that's probably something he arrived at that was best for him. And then later it became, when he was teaching, and because, Tarkovsky's famous lectures, which have sort of recently been uncovered, the audio of his lectures. I mean, he just stood on a stage for 2 hours at a time and spoke into a microphone. No clips, no visual material, no nothing. It was just Tarkovsky theorizing and philosophizing and basically commanding his students, this is how you must make a film, time pressure, sequence shot, truth of the shot, and so on and so forth, And he would attack other filmmakers who did not follow these theories, such as Eisenstein, who was, his sort of nemesis in his mind. Too much editing, too much cutting, don't cut, he's sort of commanding the students. So there's someone who reached a point where, he was teaching. And then maybe the teaching made his theory, firstly, more systematic, more explicit, and also maybe even a bit more rigid.
Yeah. Telling people not to do things is it's not a great. I'm not as comfortable with that, because I mean, ultimately, someone like Tarkovsky, there must have been a moment where he sat in a cinema watching his film or a rough cut or whatever, and he thought, "Oh, I like this bit. I'm going to do more of this."
Yeah.
I ruined it because I that's too short. It should have gone on for longer. What if I did this, but it went on a bit, twice as long? Wonder what that would look like. There must be that kind of moment where you just, and likewise, and this is something I wanted to come on to. There must be the moment where a film director sits and watches his assembly cut for everybody will know this, but it's a rough cut of all this, often multiple versions of the same scene and whatnot, put together when you finish principal photography usually. But there must be moments where you're sitting in the cinema watching that material, and you're thinking, this isn't working. This isn't, I need to change something. And maybe I haven't got time for this film. This film's going to go out and it's going to be greeted as whatever. But I need to change my method because this I'm going to learn my lessons.
Mm. Yeah, and I think this may happen more often than we think. I can give you an incredible example of this. I was in an audience for one of the very first screenings of Ho Shen's what is now, I think, officially his last film, The Assassin, um, and that's 2015. So he was on stage in Belgium with his main writer, a woman that he's collaborated with for many years, and she told a story which kind of broke the collective heart of the audience. Which is basically, she told the story of they spent years writing The Assassin. Then there was a very, very elaborate production, very long, drawn out shooting, incredible, because it's a historical film and, so much work on the production of it. And then she says, then Ho went away and edited the assembly. And then there was the day where he unveiled the assembly. And she said, the writer said, she and everyone else in the room was in tears and turned to Ho and said, "You've destroyed the film. You've
Mm.
completely destroyed our film. What the hell were you thinking? And Jose Shen was shocked that this response, but immediately he clicked into action and he verified this on the stage this day in Belgium. He immediately sort of saw the light. He said, "Okay, I start again." And then he totally restarted the entire, assembly montage of The Assassin. And according to the writer, he rescued then he rescued himself from his own his own
Wow.
mistakes. So, when you think of, the number of films that Ho Shen had made, the absolutely identifiable, familiar.
Meet Christine. She loves shopping. And this is the sound of fashion overload. Too many fabulous things, not enough space. So Christine started selling with The Real Real.
I've always loved collecting designer pieces, Gucci bags, Prada heels, but my style keeps evolving. Selling with The Real Real? Game changer. I earn more, and they do everything.
Seriously, just drop off your items or schedule a pickup. We handle the photos, descriptions, pricing, even shipping. You just sit back and watch your items sell fast to our 38 million members.
And I get peace of mind knowing I earn more selling with The Real Real than anywhere else.
Exactly. That's the sound of your closet working for you. The Real Real. Earn more, save time, sell fast. And right now, you can get an extra $100 site credit when you sell for the first time. Go to therealreal.com to get your extra $100. Therealreal.com. That's therealreal.com.
Signature style of Ho Shen. But even he could, totally screw up a film, according to his collaborators. His chief writer, he totally screwed the film up and had to rescue himself, by redoing the assembly.
That's so interesting. And it's so interesting that he should change his mind as well, which again, I mean, I like the idea that the title of your book is active. It's filmmakers thinking, it's
Yeah,
progressive, it's continuous, it's not filmmakers thoughts.
yeah,
It's not
exactly.
it's not some endpoint they've arrived at. And I'm really interested in how that. I mean, I remember one of the stories about Michael Cimino. It's not from the famous book about Heaven's Gate. It's from the more recent biography of Cimino, and it kind of gives me a new idea of Heaven's Gate in that it sort of blames Cimino for starting to second guess himself.
Yeah.
That if he'd stuck with his initial cut, he might have had more, he might have had more chance of produce, but because he started to, okay, I'll try and get it down to 90 minutes, it
Mhm.
was that point where he lost the plot because he no longer had hold of his vision, which in a way um is kind of it, but it just shows how I mean, I've sat again, going back to festivals, I've sat in master classes which are, I always think, are wrong on two counts. They're very rarely classes, and I sort of balk at the name master anyway. Sort of like we're sitting at the feet of even if it's David Cronenberg, even if it is these giants, I kind of don't want, it's an anathema to feel that, you know, we're passively receiving this wisdom. Um, but I've sat in these masterclasses thinking, you got here by hook or by crook.
Mm.
I mean, Werner Herzog is very good on this, for instance, where he's very open about the improvisational sense of his cinema, the sort of renegade banditry that
Mm.
passes for a method.
Yes, look, I can completely agree with you that, when it comes to master classes, I think there was a certain kind of director, including Abbas Kiarostami and Raoul Ruiz and Werner Herzog, who much preferred to do classes where they actually all make something, where uh, he or she, the supposed master, is really just a person in the room, of course, with some aura of authority. But, basically it's like, well, Victor Ruiz also does this, and he does it with little kids, he travels around Spain and goes to primary schools and, shoots some stuff with little kids, of course he's not a master to them,
Yeah, yeah.
it's more like, okay, pick up the camera, what do you want to film this kid hitting this other kid, okay, do it, and then, later in the afternoon, Victor will kind of edit it up on his laptop and show it to the kids, and they kind of talk about it and have a laugh about it. So those sorts of more sort of making, practices, making together and sort of inventing something with nothing, with no money, this is I mean, Raoul Ruiz, he loved doing this kind of stuff. If he was asked to teach either at a university or a film school, but he would always say, "Okay, I'll only do it if we make a film while I'm there." If it's a week, if it's 2 weeks, whatever it is, we're going to make a film. Get me a video camera. And we might need a few $1,000. Just for a few props, a few this, a few that. For lunch each day. And we'll make a feature film, while we're there. And I saw one of the feature films he made, literally in the classroom. I mean, they didn't leave the classroom,
Mm.
and it was all a thing where with the students, he said, "Okay, we're going to make a film about a jury at a film festival, trying to come up with a winner and their discussions, which will, through some various surreal turns that Raoul kind of suggested, that okay, so you're going to look at a film on the TV set, and then you will all disappear into the TV set." And in the TV set, you'll be on a television show, which is a jury, So it was all just mirroring games, and but it was all shot in one room,
Mm.
on a very cheap video camera. But that's a film that got shown at the Rotterdam Film Festival, and Raoul was very proud of it. I remember he said to me, he says, "From this experience, I learnt one thing: uh, give me $10,000 to make a film, or give me 10 million, but don't give me anything in between."
Right, right. Very good. Very wise words. I mean, I think, how do you, I mean, there are certain times when filmmakers try to more formalize a philosophy. So I'm thinking of like when there was the dogma movement with Lars von Trier and Wittenberg and others. Um, Also, when Terrence Malick had his first collaboration with Emmanuel
Lubezki.
Lubezki, otherwise known as Chivo, and they wrote down a sort of 10-point plan, which they called a dogma. That is our dogma, and they kind of stuck to that. I think it was first for the New World, and then for pretty much all the subsequent films up until A Hidden Life. And also that dogma was very much used on The Revenant, for instance, that Chivo went on to shoot. For Alejandro Inarritu. What do you think of those sort of formalizing the process? Like, okay, here are the rules, and let's find our freedom within a structure.
Yeah.
Let's find something fresh within by restricting ourselves and not doing the. Yeah, I think that. I mean, if me and you decided let's write a dogma for movies today, I mean, I've got a few suggestions, like under everything's got to be 100 minutes or less. No guns. Movies without guns. I want to see more movies without guns, please.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, I think these kinds of, rule-based procedures, as they're called, can be very generative. I think they can also sometimes be too rigid. And in the case of the original, dogma films of Von Trier and so on, it very quickly, people started, ignoring the rules and throwing the rules out and bending the rules beyond recognition. But for a while, it kind of worked. And I think some filmmakers, one of the strong examples in my mind is Chantal Akerman, and she actually explained to me when I was on a jury with her. She explained to me that when she is about to make a film, when she has a subject, a project, basically she works out what she called the parameters, and the parameters might be, I'm only going to use this palette of colors, red, blue, green, and I'll only move the camera in a certain way, no zoom shots, no creeping forward with the camera, only creeping in front of, sort of laterally. She might say something like, yes, the film will be 80 minutes, 10-minute scenes. Her and Jean Godard and others often would start with the sort of a principles to generate the form of the film, and I guess at some moments there's going to be an occasion where the director feels they need to sort of break their own rule, or perhaps they're leading to a point where the principles or the rules will suddenly break and there'll be a different kind of shot, at the very end of the film for a special sort of surprise, sort of shock effect. One can see that in films of Manuel de Oliveira, for instance, that sometimes he would kind of keep a certain kind of thing until the very end of the film. A certain color will burst forth in the last moments of the film. Polanski, I believe, is someone who follows this principle that sometimes you're watching his films, and I always have the feeling with Polanski that he's saving something for the end, some kind of camera move, some kind of thing that he's deliberately restrained from doing for the rest of the film. And so that's his sort of rule-based principle, is to sort of hide something until the very end of the film. So I think
brilliant example of sorry to interrupt you, Adrian, but I've got to jump in with a brilliant example of that is Chinatown, where the whole film is very much shot with classical camera moves from the Hollywood era, and then when it gets to the very last scene, it suddenly becomes handheld and almost like a TV crew is surrounding the action, and you're suddenly in medium cool. You're suddenly in Haskell Wexler's, it's this isn't fake, it's real, and then you have a huge crane shot out of it. And so sorry to interrupt, but that was that just had to illustrate that point because it just popped into my mind.
It's a great example. I think we could look at almost any Polanski film and find some kind of remarkable example of that. And later in his career, sort of late in his career, even more than very early on. So that was obviously a sort of a personal procedure. But Polanski is one of those directors. He doesn't like to talk about his own principles, his own methods. He likes to boast that he's a master of film language and everything, but he's not going to define film language for you. He simply says, I was ahead of everyone with the syntax of shots, and he was saying this already in the 60s. But like many directors, some directors do like to have their trade secrets, as they're called. They don't want to lay out everything, every bit of their creative process. They don't want to get copied too easily, and but also that it's some kind of personal pride that it's their secret.
Yeah, how did you get that shot? I'm not going to tell you that. That's I remember Steven Spielberg shooting Saving Private Ryan, and the juddering that he got on the cameras was he fixed a drill to the camera, like a DIY drill. And so he turned it on, and that would judder the camera and give that sort of machine gun look. And it's kind of one of those things that as soon as you see it, it's like, oh wow, I've not seen that before. That's has an effect that is amazing. And someone like Stanley Kubrick would be phoning him up and saying, "How did you do that? That was because I want it, because I want to use it." Would put that in my toolbox as well. Um, Going back a little bit to sort of the golden era of cinema to some extent. There's also this argument that there is a period, or there is filmmakers who don't have a style, who don't have a, more than even the Mike Nichols sort of, I'm not an author, but the whole idea is you're to disappear and just allow the audience to have an immediate relationship with the work in front of them, rather than to be feeling like it's being filmed or directed, or there's a stylistic choice being made. And you sort of you quite rightly sort of address this.
Mm. Well, I don't think it's a very helpful idea. It's certainly not for any of us who are critics or teachers or analysts, to simply say, "Oh, the style of this film is invisible." It sort of it doesn't get you anywhere, And one of the things that really inspired me with thinking through this issue was Sidney Lumet, and Sidney Lumet, often preached exactly what you're saying. This line that an audience shouldn't notice the style. They should be involved in the story, involved in the characters, totally taken into the illusion that the film creates. If they notice the camera, it's wrong. It throws the spectator out of the film, and so on and so forth. But when Lumet was interviewed, I remember there's this wonderful interview where basically he's saying all of that, and then the interviewer said, "So you don't really have a style then?" And then, of course, Lumet exploded and started saying, "What are you talking about? Of course I have a style. I have my camera lens plot. I have a graph of what the camera will do. I show a piece of sky, or I don't. I black out the windows for certain effects. Of course I have a style. And you should notice it because you're a critic. If you don't notice it, you're not doing your job." So there was this sort of split thing that, there was sort of, as it were, the naive spectator who has to just be involved. And then there's the critic who has to notice what a stylist Sidney Lumet really is. And for me, that was an idea that, well, finally, style is not invisible. It can sort of try to be less visible. People like George Cukor said this, Andre de Toth, these classical era directors. But I tend to believe that if we now sit down with 5 Andre de Toth films, we are going to see a style there. We're going to see a particular way of framing, of moving the camera, of cutting, of directing the actors, of the rhythm of the scenes, of the length of the scenes, of telling the story. We are going to see that. I mean, I agree with one of your previous guests, Daniel Kramer, and his recent book on where he talks about each director has a way of seeing, which begins with the very choice of the subject, or their agreement to take a subject on. There's something in them that is drawing them. They have some personal investment somewhere, or they find a personal investment in the material, and so straight away there's some possibility of a signature, of a personal viewpoint on the material, a personal shaping of the material. So that's what I look for in films, as as a critic, as a teacher, as a writer, and so on. Is I'm looking for these sort of telltale marks of a personal style, or a personal work on the material. And I'm rarely disappointed. If a director interests me and I watch a number of their films, it's usually not that hard to find the traces of this of this particular way of seeing.
It's like an accentless voice. It depends a lot on on the cultural moment. An accentless voice in 1930 sounds now to us like a incredibly heavily accented voice
Yeah.
because it
Yeah.
has all these class preconceptions written into it. I mean, I think one of my favorite filmmakers is Michael Curtiz, and he's
Yeah.
often sort of dismissed as because but generally he's a hugely stylistic filmmaker. It's just
For
his
sure.
style was so influential it became kind of the house style for Warner Brothers.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, it sort of became it was a victim of its own success in a sense that
Yeah. And also, I think in the classical period, particularly with somebody like Michael Curtiz, who's moving through so many different genres and formats, mystery, adventure, romantic comedy, and almost every film is hopping off
musicals.
to a different genre. And so, of course, his style changes to some extent to fit that genre. And so what he does in Casablanca is, not what he does in some other film exactly. Of course, he's changing for each genre. But when directors work across many genres, it's easy to say, oh, they have no style, they have no signature. But it just means you got to look a bit harder.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, it's sort of like there is definitely something Michael Curtiz about White Christmas in
Mm.
just the same way as I mean, I always find it difficult interesting that he made the wonderfully inclusive Casablanca and then he made the sort of horrifically racist The Santa Fe Trail. The same filmmaker. How could you possibly be doing this? With the liberal Humphrey Bogart and the crypto fascist Errol Flynn. It just
Mm.
feels really. It's such a strange. Um, it's like having a favorite uncle suddenly have one glass too many and tell you what they really think about immigrants.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's very much a thing in film history that directors like Curtiz and other uh, directors who really wanted to keep their professional job in Hollywood. As the times changed, they had to do the politics of the scripts were changing, and they in a sense had no choice but to have to express a different political viewpoint in the 50s than in the 30s. And it's like for Russian filmmakers going through the revolutionary period into Stalinism, and a director like Boris Barnett, who I think is absolutely a genius, one of my favorite filmmakers. And the kind of more working class sort of revolutionary fun and fervor of his first films at a certain point has to become more towing the line with Stalinist ideas of entertainment and instruction and all this kind of stuff. But still, Boris Barnett is Boris Barnett, from the first film to the last. There's no one who directs and cuts and puts a film together the way he does. But he had to sort of grin and bear. If he wanted to literally stay alive, he had to and keep working. He had to sort of follow the changing lines of the time and the regime.
And even harder, predict them what they would be like a year on when the film actually comes out.
Yeah,
That's
you said it. Yeah.
roller skating on the edge of a cliff.
Yeah.
Um, is there any filmmaker who, in reading what or talking to them, you've it's made you sort of change your opinion of them. It's made you sort of go back to the film and go, oh, wait a minute, hang on, I'll have a look at that again because maybe I was judging it too severely, or maybe I just wasn't getting what it was. Um, yeah, the process gives you. I mean, I had that a little bit with say Dario Argento, a little bit with Nicholas Roeg as well. My first reactions to both those filmmakers actually were and both of whom I encountered when I was really, early teens, 13, 14, and just getting interested in film. And I would be watching them going, oh, these are kind of ugly films. They're kind of,
Mm.
I like
Mm.
beautiful films. I like films that have good, nice looking shots. And then it took me a while to, first of all, appreciate that beauty wasn't everything, and secondly, actually there's a lot of beauty in these. I just need to change
Yeah.
my definition of beauty.
Yeah.
Are there any people? Well, I mean, that was more in maturing than sort of reading behind. That was more maturing and growing into cinema. But have there been any filmmakers you've given a second chance to, or?
Well, I certainly can give you an example from the book of someone whose career and whose films I started to see in a totally new and sort of expansive way, and that's Marco Bellocchio. And now I've never been down on Bellocchio. I always had respect for him as a filmmaker, but I hadn't gone much into his career, and I liked him, but I hadn't investigated him. And then at a certain point, about 20 years ago, I stumbled upon this whole remarkable story of Bellocchio's collaboration with his psychoanalyst. Like literally, he brought in his psychoanalyst Massimo Fagioli, and he said, "You got to help me. You got to help me direct the film Devil in the Flesh." This happened in the 1980s. Bellocchio was having a breakdown basically, and he said, "Come on the set and help me direct the actors, and help me make the film." So Fagioli did that, and then, as it were, stayed on and became the co-scriptwriter with Bellocchio of various things. And the text that I read was this fascinating transcription of a public talk given by Fagioli and Bellocchio, but mainly by Fagioli, because Bellocchio just sort of sat there silently. And Fagioli said, "Well, Marco and I have developed a theory of film. And the theory of film is that there are basically three kinds of scenes in a film. There are scenes that are about normality, normal everyday rituals and movements and getting up, having breakfast, going to work, everything that's a ritual and ordinary and predictable. And then the second kind of image, the second kind of scene are dreams, dream scenes. And dreams don't solve anything, they don't resolve anything, but they point to problems. They point to problems that are repressed in the normal life." And then he says, and then the third kind of scene is where somehow the characters in the film and the film itself have taken the cues from the dreams, they've learnt something from the dream, and then movement, literally human movement, is reborn in a new way. People dance, people walk differently, people plunge through doorways that they've never dared to open, literally. And he says, that's how we plan our films now, with the idea that there are three images. And once I thought, well, I think that's a very intriguing theory. And then you start to look at the later Bellocchio films, particularly from the mid 80s onwards, and they're all made to this. Like, it's really quite incredible. Bellocchio becomes obsessed with dream sequences, but dream sequences that in themselves are very mysterious and enigmatic, but they lead literally to new movements, people who get out of their repressions, who manage to move and love and speak and sing in a different way, compared to their ordinary life, which the film usually starts with. And you can look at anything Bellocchio has done for television or cinema, and he really has used this idea as a spur to his own creativity, with and without Fagioli as his co-writer. And so I started to see a whole meaning and a richness and a structure in Bellocchio's films that I probably would not have spotted that, if Fagioli hadn't said there are three kinds of images, and in some senses a crazy theory, probably doesn't explain everything that happens in Bellocchio's films, but it explains a lot, or it points you to a lot of things going on. So that really opened my eyes.
That reminds me of Mark Gatiss once told me that the second person to speak in a murder mystery is a killer.
That's great.
It's just one of those things that it's almost, I can't remember if it was the second or the third, but there was some number of, watch a film and the second person who's not the investigator or the policeman or the victim is the killer. And
I must try that one out.
Yeah, Bellocchio's a great filmmaker, and he's continuing. I mean, he's got a TV series that's just Portobello that's just come out. I interviewed him a couple of times for for various of his films and his work. And I mean, he must be in his 80s now,
Yeah, he's
and
86, I believe.
yeah, yeah, and still going strong. I mean, you do get a feeling with these veteran filmmakers, Spielberg similarly, Clint Eastwood obviously, who's got another film which is in post-production at the
Mm.
moment, um, that they have very much got their team, their squad around them, and they're just running and everybody knows what everybody else wants,
Yeah.
almost without, there's an unspoken language that goes from years of collaboration. And you basically just give the nod. Yep, keep doing what you're doing.
Yes. Oh, I think that's true. Many filmmakers, Ingmar Bergman, Alan Rene, and, right through to the examples you're giving, Clint Eastwood and so on, Spielberg, yeah, I mean, this sort of unspoken understanding of the particular directorial language of a director, it must be so sort of soaked into the preparations and the work on the set. I mean, no one needs to ask Clint Eastwood, "Oh, do you want a lyrical crane shot here?" Of course, he doesn't want a lyrical crane shot there. He wants a static frame. He wants everything visible. He wants it to be clear within the image. No one's going to ask him a dopey question, that's outside the Eastwood style at this point of his career. That's for sure.
There was an interview I had with Ethan Cohen, and he was talking about editing and how, you're watching a thing, and it was really interesting how certain he was because he would say, and then you just know that's right, and that's where to cut it, and it
Mm,
was just like you just know that's exactly right. And then I've talked to other filmmakers who are much more, oh, we edited this 100 different ways, and it was
mm,
only after like towards the end of the movie that I went back to the scene and I thought, well, wait a minute, if I move it here, and it's almost like their process is experimental, almost like, well, one particular filmmaker I talked to was telling me that the end product is kind of not so much the end product as a byproduct of all the
mm.
questions that are being
Yeah.
that the process of filmmaking is asking, and really it's the questioning that is more interesting intellectually for this particular filmmaker than I mean, we were talking privately, so I can't really say who it was, than the final, product. And
Mm,
I just thought that's really interesting. One of them is I know I'm going to produce a sort of Dashiell Hammett type film, and this is how I make it, and here it is, and that's Miller's
mm.
Crossing. And the other is like, well, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I literally don't know what I'm doing, and
Mm.
I like that. That's how I'm going to go forward.
Yeah, that reminds me of a story, which is a sort of a variation on both methods, really. Which is it's in Paul Hirsch's book. Hirsch, very famous, celebrated editor. He talks a lot in his book about working with Brian De Palma, and Brian De Palma is someone who is known to sort of march into the editing room and start beating out like this shot goes 1, 2, 3, 4, cut. This is his sort of commands to the editors, but not always, right? And Paul Hirsch tells the story of Brian was off shooting something. And Paul was editing the film The Fury with Kirk Douglas, and he said there was this scene he had the script in front of him and he had the shots but there was a thing that he couldn't work out, which is there was close-ups of a fist clenching on a sofa, and Hirsch couldn't work out where this fit into the scene. It wasn't in the script. So he rang up De Palma and said, Brian, you've got to explain to me what's this thing with the fist, where does that go? And Brian barked at him, you work it out. Which is fantastic. Like, he wouldn't even answer a simple question, but it was like, use your own creativity, buddy, come up with something,
That's what I pay you the big bucks for.
That's right. And it's like an element of it was surprise me, do something with this.
Right.
And Hirsch finally, he worked it out. He worked out that for one character, he was going to make him clench his fist, through the montage, and it worked out. It's in the film. It's in the final film. So the department store said, "Yeah, good work. You solved that one really well." So there's this playful, professional thing here of filmmakers challenging each other to be creative.
That's what I think. I mean, Walter Murch, to go from one legendary editor to another, his editing of Apocalypse Now, while Francis Ford Coppola was kind of convalescing essentially because he burnt himself out shooting the film. That's why I think that all the subsequent versions, the Redux and everything, which is obviously much more Francis Ford Coppola being hands-on, I think those versions of the film are more Francis Ford Coppola, but they're worse films.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, I mean, the conversation, the key moment in the conversation had very little to do with Francis Ford Coppola beyond him saying, "Oh yeah, okay, I like that. Okay,
Yeah.
I guess that'll do," and was actually against his method because his whole idea of the conversation was we don't change the conversation. You just think it's changed. And Walter Murch was like, "Well, no, I'm going to change the line reading. I've found another line reading.
Yeah.
I'm going to put that in instead. So you're actually hearing a different conversation, not just thinking you are." So we go back in a way. We go back to right to the beginning of our conversation of those interesting. But as you said, Francis Ford Coppola has to say, "Yep, I'll go with that. I can put my name on that."
That's right. Yeah.
Well, listen, Adrian, it's been a wonderful conversation. Final question: what film book would you like to recommend?
Well, one that I haven't read yet, but I'm really looking forward is Ken Jacobs' sort of collected sort of writings and classes. Ken Jacobs, who died not so long ago, and so did his partner and collaborator Flo Jacobs. Experimental filmmaker, video maker, and I had the intense pleasure of being with him in a few film festivals. An incredible person, and full of thoughts about everything, and truly a thinking filmmaker. And there's a legend of his classes where he would do, he would have a stop motion, like an analytic projector, and frame by frame, like on a Nicholas Ray film. He would take Nicholas Ray's They Live by Night, and frame by frame he would work through it for hours with his students. Look at this frame, look at this frame, and well, hopefully some of the fruits of this, which he never wrote as a book or anything like that, but I think the fruits of some of these classes and things are in this new book of collected writings of Ken Jacobs. So this is definitely one that I'm really, really keen to read.
Excellent. That's a brilliant recommendation. Thank you so much, Adrian, for joining me. Your book is out right now, so people can order it online from Sticking Place Books or anywhere you get your books. It's available, and it's called Filmmakers Thinking. I'm just going to add a small advert for my own novel, which is out at the moment, Connery, a novel, which is available from plumeria.co.uk. If you want to order that, you would make a young man happy. Thanks again, Adrian. It's been, as ever, an informative, great pleasure.
Thanks, John. It's always great to talk to you.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.